Hey guys, tonight we're not diving into the clash of steel or the grandeur of feasts, but something far more intimate and, frankly, more odorous. We're stepping into a world where the idea of a bath could stir suspicion, where staying dry was seen as both holy and healthy, and where your morning might begin with someone tossing an unmentionable surprise out the window. So if you're listening in the dark, maybe curled under the covers or walking quietly through the evening, just take a deep breath, though maybe not too deep, and let yourself drift backward into a different age, when hygiene wasn't just neglected, but misunderstood on a spectacular scale. In the earliest centuries of the Middle Ages, cleanliness hadn't yet fallen from grace. Monastic communities still held onto vestiges of Roman custom, bathing in warm waters and soaking in stone structures that echoed the once glorious baths of the empire. These monks scrubbed with purpose, not just to please God, but to maintain bodily order. And in towns where aqueducts still dripped and tiled pools hadn't yet crumbled, public bathhouses offered a chance to wash away more than just physical grime. They were places of renewal, shared warmth, and, perhaps most scandalously of all, casual nudity. But as the centuries crept forward, something changed. A shadow of suspicion fell across these once practical rituals. By the late medieval period, the practice of full-body bathing had fallen out of favor, not because of laziness, but out of genuine fear. People began to believe that hot water opened the skin, not in a poetic way, but literally. It was thought that pores, once widened by steam and heat, became vulnerable gateways for invisible diseases. To immerse yourself in a tub was, in the minds of many, to open the door and invite death inside. The plague only reinforced this belief. During outbreaks, some people avoided washing entirely, convinced that water would pull illness into their bodies like a sponge soaking up rot. It wasn't simply superstition, it was a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. Without microscopes, without an understanding of germs, or even the idea that bad smells could carry infection, water became suspect. That which once cleansed, now corrupted. And then there was the matter of morality. Bathhouses, once benign, began to attract less saintly reputations. By the 13th century, the communal bath had become a place not just for cleansing, but for pleasure, sometimes innocent, sometimes not. Gossip swirled through the streets that these buildings were no longer houses of hygiene, but dens of temptation. The church, ever alert to potential sin, took note. Nudity was already frowned upon. Nudity with strangers in heated rooms was practically an invitation for divine punishment. And so, slowly but surely, the public bathhouse closed its doors. Or, more accurately, they were shut down by a mixture of scandal, fear, and spiritual policing. But people didn't stop washing entirely. They just changed how they did it. The grand soak, once celebrated in stone tubs and steam-filled rooms, became a rare event, reserved for the wealthy, the reckless, or those too itchy to care. In its place came the art of partial cleanliness. Faces, hands, and feet might be wiped with cloths soaked in water infused with herbs. Arms might be scrubbed before meals, especially among those who could afford scented oils or vinegar rinses. It wasn't a complete abandonment of cleanliness. It was a shift in priorities, a tactical retreat from what was seen as a dangerous indulgence. This wasn't a world of mud-caked peasants staggering through dung-filled alleys, as some might imagine. People cared in their own way. They combed their hair, changed their linens, dabbed their skin with lavender water. But they did so in a world where science hadn't yet caught up with superstition, where tradition wrestled with fear, and where sometimes staying dry was the closest thing to staying safe. Long before scented soaps and porcelain bathtubs, there was the bathhouse. Not yet a forbidden place of whispers and wandering hands, but a communal hub where warmth, cleanliness, and casual conversation coexisted in steamy, tiled harmony. In the earlier medieval centuries, these spaces held on to the last fading echoes of Roman tradition. Water was still a remedy, a ritual, and a relief. Townsfolk, monks, merchants, and the occasional noble could gather in shared tubs, gossiping, scrubbing, steaming away the weight of the day like peas in a pot, minus the broth and herbs. But by the 13th century, something began to curdle in the waters. The bathhouse, once a symbol of order and health, transformed into something more ambiguous. Stories circulated of attendants who were far too attentive, of rooms where laughter lingered a bit too long, and of services offered with a wink rather than a washcloth. Bathing became a performance not of hygiene, but of intimacy, of blurred boundaries and whispered transactions. The scent of rosemary and steam mingled with the scent of trouble. Church leaders did not watch from the shadows for long. To them, these steamy gathering places had become morally suspect, temptation wrapped in towels and tiled walls. Bathhouses were now linked not only to disease, but to decadence. The body, they reminded the faithful, was sacred, and the naked body, especially when submerged in warm, shared water, was a slippery slope toward sin. As sermons denounced the flesh and the folly of exposure, municipal authorities followed suit, closing down the most scandalous of these establishments or repurposing them into bakeries and storerooms. The fires that once boiled water now baked bread. Cleanliness, once communal, became private, and in many cases vanished altogether. Even within monasteries, once the last bastions of regular bathing, the tides shifted. Though monks had long upheld routines of washing, rotating between quiet pools and humble basins as part of spiritual and bodily discipline, even they began to scale back. Not because they had lost faith in cleanliness, but because the societal air around hygiene had grown thick with anxiety. The church never outlawed washing outright, but made it difficult, inconvenient, and layered with implication. And so, the culture shifted. Bathing became a rarity, a luxury, and occasionally a secret. People adjusted. They learned to stay dry and still appear clean. Soap, if used at all, was reserved for clothing or for the hands. Water was treated like a wild animal, helpful if tamed, but dangerous if mishandled. The phrase, "cleanliness is next to godliness," might ring through modern ears, but to the medieval mind, too much washing was next to vanity, and vanity was the gateway to downfall. Yet no one wanted to walk around filthy. So they bathed in pieces. A cloth dipped in warm water, and vinegar would suffice for a hand or a face. Rinses made from herbs were dabbed behind the ears or rubbed into armpits. The term sponge bath didn't exist, but the method certainly did. No sponges, mind you. Linen cloths were the tools of choice, wielded with care, sometimes by servants, sometimes alone by candlelight. And what about the wealthy? Oh, they bathed. Not frequently, but memorably. Picture a servant struggling with a cauldron of boiling water, pouring it into a wooden tub lined with cloth, sprinkling it with petals and rosemary. The noble would lower themselves into what was essentially an herbal soup, seated near a fireplace or even in their bedchamber, because privacy, too, was fluid. If your rank was high enough, you might not bathe alone. A spouse, a companion, even an attending handmaid might join or assist. The line between romance and ritual blurred like steam on a cold window pane. The poor washed as they could, in rivers, barrels, even puddles. Their baths were pragmatic, not symbolic. A child, a shirt, and a goat might all be cleaned in the same tub on the same morning. In winter, water froze. Bathing paused. Dirt was layered under wool. The hope was not to feel fresh, but to survive. Cleanliness waited for warmer winds. Still in the cities of southern Europe, where sunlight lingered longer and Roman aqueducts hadn't yet fully crumbled, the dream of regular bathing held on. Bathhouses survived here and there. Some clean and respectable, others offering not just steam, but secrets. Either way, patrons emerged pink-faced and mildly judged, caught somewhere between virtue and vice. Bathing was no longer a simple act. It was a decision, a negotiation between fear and necessity, between modesty and need. The human body hadn't changed, but the way people treated it, washed it, and thought about it, those things had drifted, warped by doctrine, fear, and myth. Yet even in the most cautious corners of Christendom, people still wiped their faces with rose water, combed out the lice, changed their linen shirts, and dreamed of being just clean enough to get by. In a world where full-body baths were eyed with suspicion, linen emerged as the quiet hero of the medieval hygiene routine. It wasn't luxurious, it didn't sparkle. But it worked, worn close to the body, tucked beneath heavier layers of wool or fur. Linen absorbed sweat, grime, and the evidence of a life lived in motion. In a time when the act of washing one's body was tangled in fear, linen offered a workaround. Clean the cloth, not the skin. People didn't necessarily bathe, but they changed their linen shirts. Sometimes once a week, sometimes twice if they were especially fastidious or wealthy. In some regions, this single act of swapping a soiled underlayer for a clean one counted as a personal hygiene victory, and in truth, it often was. Beneath a noble's silk tunic or a peasant's patched woolen garb, there was usually a linen shift quietly doing the hard work. These undergarments soaked up moisture, trapped odors, and shielded outer clothes from the full force of the body's functions. And these shifts and shirts were everywhere. Knights wore them under chainmail to keep armor from turning into an oven of rot. Monks wrapped themselves in linen beneath their robes. Even field hands, scraping out a living from sun-baked soil, managed to find or fashion a linen tunic. It might be threadbare. It might smell like goats, but it served its purpose. If it could be washed, and importantly, dried without freezing solid, it was far preferable to washing the person inside it. Cleaning linen was an ordeal of its own. Boiling water, scrubbing boards, a good measure of lye, or if you didn't mind the stench, aged human urine, chamber lye, prized for its ammonia content. Wash days weren't serene. They were grueling, communal, and loud, filled with slapping paddles and women shouting over riverside rocks. Still, it was easier and less risky than soaking your own skin in questionable water. Meanwhile, hair posed another challenge. Contrary to some grimy caricatures, medieval folk didn't walk around with haystacks on their heads. They combed regularly, using bone or wooden combs with finely spaced teeth. These weren't just for vanity. They were weapons in the daily war against lice. Combing was as routine as bread baking or prayer, part of life, part of survival. As for washing hair, it happened, but not often, and never with the ease we know today. Shampoo didn't exist, but substitutes did. Some used soap made from animal fat and ash, harsh and scouring. Others experimented with herbal rinses, rosemary, lavender, even beer. Egg yolks were considered a mild cleanser, though the image of raw yolk sliding down the neck in a cold room would test the courage of anyone. Water quality was always a gamble, and hot water, if you had the firewood, was seen as dangerous to the brain, the soul, or both. Lukewarm, ideally touched by herbs, was the safe middle ground. For noble women, hair wasn't just washed, it was maintained, braided, veiled, perfumed. Hours were spent weaving strands into intricate coils. A single misstep near an open flame could undo a day's work or worse. But they endured, because long, well-kept hair was a mark of status, of order. It said, "Someone cares for me, someone sees me." Dental care was another battlefield of good intentions and limited resources. No toothbrushes, but cloths soaked in salt, mint or crushed herbs did the trick, at least to a degree. People chewed sticks, fraying one end to scrub their teeth. Breath was freshened with fennel, cloves, or cardamom, assuming you could afford the spice or steal it. Charcoal was also used, mixed with oil or honey into gritty pastes that scrubbed with the enthusiasm of sandpaper. There was no pretense of whitening. The goal was survival. If your teeth stayed in your head and didn't reek too badly, you were winning. Dentists were a last resort. Often barbers in their spare time, they would extract a problem tooth with no anesthesia, just a firm grip, maybe a prayer, and a gut full of courage. Post-care involved wine, vinegar, or blind hope. And yet, despite the crude methods, people often had better dental health than modern snackers. With low-sugar diets and coarse bread, their teeth weren't white, but they weren't necessarily falling out either, until infection set in, or still, the smells. The constant, unavoidable smells. In towns without plumbing, where pigs roamed freely and chamber pots were emptied into the street with a cry of warning, the air itself felt heavy. And so, medieval folk invented ways to fight back. Pomanders, small balls of scent-stuffed metal or wood, hung from belts or were tucked into clothing. Herbs were braided into hair, sewn into bodices, or scattered in bedclothes. Anything to mask the scent of unwashed bodies, animals, and waste. Perfume, when available, was imported and expensive. Rose oil, civet, musk. These were dabs of dignity, whiffs of wealth. But for most, scent came from what was on hand. Lavender in the fields, rosemary in the garden, vinegar in a bowl. You couldn't escape the odor, but you could disguise your place in it. Imagine walking through a medieval town, not the romanticized cobblestone village with flower boxes and storybook charm, but the real thing. The streets weren't paved. They were packed with mud and waste, churned daily by hoof, wheel, and foot. Animals roamed freely, dropping reminders of their presence. Butchers threw offal into the gutters. Bakers tossed scraps. Chamber pots emptied from second-story windows. If you heard a cry from above, you'd best step lively or risk becoming an unfortunate footnote in the sanitation crisis of the 14th century. There were no underground sewers, not in most places. What existed was a primitive version of drainage. Open ditches lining the roads, sometimes with wooden planks laid across. These channels were meant to carry away refuse, but they clogged, overflowed, or froze. And when they froze, the smells didn't stop. They just waited. It wasn't that medieval people didn't notice. They did. They just didn't have the infrastructure or understanding to fix it. And so, coping mechanisms emerged. Scent became a shield. Wealthier folk carried perfumed handkerchiefs, held delicately under the nose as they walked through crowded markets or alleyways. Spices, herbs, and resins were burned or crushed into salves. Scented wax balls, pomanders, and sachets dangled from belts or were sewn into garments. If you couldn't change the air, you changed how it reached you. The average person didn't expect to smell good. They simply hoped not to offend. And in a world where everyone was living under the same olfactory cloud, the standards shifted. Body odor wasn't a flaw. It was identity. People knew the smell of their households, their friends, even their lords. The scent of sweat, wood smoke, damp wool, and boiled root vegetables was as familiar as a handshake. Still, people tried. Alum powder, mined from natural deposits, was sometimes applied under the arms. It didn't stop sweat, but it dulled the scent. Others used crushed herbs or vinegar rinses, dabbing their underarms and necks with cloths soaked in rosemary water, or wine. In some places, chalk was rubbed on the skin to absorb moisture. There was no deodorant, but there was effort. Clothing didn't help. Layers were thick. Wool, linen, sometimes fur. These fabrics trapped heat, locked in moisture, and turned anyone wearing them into a walking greenhouse. Removing layers wasn't practical. It was cold. It was immodest. It was risky. So instead, people endured. They wore linen closest to the skin, hoping it would carry the worst of the sweat. They changed it as often as they could, and they prayed that no one got too close on feast days. And then there was the scratching. Lice weren't a possibility. They were a guarantee. Fleas, too. Mites. Tiny creatures that lived in hair, bedding, and clothes. People combed their hair with fine-toothed combs carved from bone or horn, raking out eggs and bugs with grim resignation. Some boiled their clothes to kill the pests. Others held garments near open flames, not to dry them, but to cook the lice inside. It wasn't uncommon to see someone lifting a tunic to the hearth, not for warmth, but for war. When things got bad, some shaved their heads, especially monks, who were already halfway there. A bald scalp was a simple solution to a persistent problem. Wigs, when worn, could become pest hotels if not properly cleaned, but that didn't stop people from using them. If nothing else, they kept appearances tidy, even if they itched like hell. For bedding, people stuffed mattresses with straw, moss, or wool. These too became havens for bugs. Some households burned sweet herbs like lavender or thyme to drive pests out. Others relied on smoke, filling rooms with it to choke out the lice and fleas. It didn't always work, but it gave the illusion of control. Toilets, as we know them, didn't exist. In castles, there were garderobes, stone seats built over holes that dropped waste into pits or the moat below. In towns, there might be communal latrines, little more than wooden boxes over dugouts. But for many, relief came wherever it could, behind a barn, in the woods, or into a chamber pot at night. And what of that pot? In the morning, its contents were thrown into the street, often with a cry of "Gardez l'eau," a warning to those below. If you were unlucky or inattentive, you might receive a very medieval kind of blessing. This world wasn't filthy by choice. It was filthy by design, or rather by a lack of it. Cleanliness existed, but it was local, improvised, and dictated by season, circumstance, and belief. People cleaned what they could, when they could, with what they had. They adapted. They endured. In the few places where public bathing survived the tide of suspicion and ecclesiastical condemnation, a strange sort of paradox bloomed. These weren't the orderly Roman bathhouses of old, with their mosaic floors and measured elegance. Nor were they entirely the dens of vice the Church warned about, though some certainly tried their best. They were something in between, strange hybrids of spa, tavern, and social theater, where hot water and gossip swirled together in the same rising steam. They were often called stews, not just because patrons stewed in hot water, but because the experience resembled being slowly simmered in a communal broth of humanity. Here, one could pay for a soak, a meal, a massage, and depending on the establishment, far more. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't rare in some regions, especially in southern and central Europe. In cities like Florence, Prague, or Nuremberg, families might attend together. So might travelers, merchants, or clergymen, though the latter were often instructed to wear modesty shifts, even in the tub. In some places, the experience was as innocent as it was restorative. Warm water, a scrub with cloth and herbs, perhaps a bite to eat while reclining in a steam room. In others, however, the lines blurred quickly. Friendly attendants offered more than towels. Boundaries softened alongside calloused feet. The bathhouse, in such cases, became not just a place to clean the body, but to indulge it. The Church, ever vigilant, took issue. Nakedness in shared spaces was troubling enough, but nakedness paired with flirtation, and worse, was considered a direct affront to both morality and public order. Warnings rang from pulpits. Edicts were issued, bathhouses were watched, raided, sometimes shut down entirely. And when plague reared its head, the final nail was hammered home. Warm water opened pores, and open pores invited death. The logic was wrong, of course. But it made emotional sense in a world that didn't understand contagion. And so the bathhouses closed, or limped along in reduced form, their tiled walls stained with the memory of cleaner days and foggy laughter. In southern Europe, the tradition held on longer. Warm weather, better plumbing, and cultural tolerance kept the doors open a little wider, a little longer. But in much of the north, the bathhouse vanished, transformed from a place of health into a whispered, cautionary tale. In the absence of public baths, private rituals evolved. For the rich, this meant elaborate setups in private chambers, barrels or wooden tubs dragged near a hearth, filled by servants with water boiled in blackened pots. Herbs were tossed in, lavender, rosemary, sage. Linen was draped over the edge, both to soften the wood and shield the bather's modesty. Some even bathed with spouses or lovers, turning the ritual into something half sacred, half sensual. The wealthy soaked rarely, but extravagantly. For the poor, there were rivers, if you lived near one, rain barrels, if you had the patience. A wooden wash tub in the kitchen where laundry, children, and dinner often crossed paths. Winter complicated everything. Water froze. Fires cost wood. So instead of bathing, people leaned on other tricks. They dabbed with cloths soaked in vinegar. They changed their linen. They pretended. And if that failed, they accepted. Washing the body became seasonal, practical, strategic. The full immersion bath was reserved for special moments, childbirth, weddings, recoveries from illness, or the unbearable urge to scrub off several months of accumulated grit. But when time, space, or belief didn't permit, there was always the linen cloth. Soaked, wrung out, and wiped across the skin, it was the medieval answer to the modern shower. Not satisfying, but sufficient. These cloths were rubbed over hands, necks, feet, the high-traffic areas. If you had someone to help you, the ritual could feel almost ceremonial. If you didn't, you did what you could and hoped your sweat would dry before it spoiled. Over time, this piecemeal cleanliness became the norm. People came to accept that a clean shirt and fresh hair might have to stand in for a clean body. And if someone smelled, well, everyone did. In all this, intention mattered. People didn't avoid bathing out of laziness or ignorance. They did it because they believed it was safer, cleaner, even holier. The body, exposed, was a vulnerable thing, subject not only to physical harm, but to moral danger. Covering it, preserving it, shielding it from water and strangers alike. This was wisdom, not weakness. And so the medieval world scratched, scented, and soaked itself in vinegar. It combed lice, burned herbs, whispered prayers, and buttoned every last layer of wool. Cleanliness was a virtue measured not in lathered bubbles or glistening skin, but in how one carried themselves through the mess, with dignity, defiance, and a very strong nose. To live in a medieval body was to live in negotiation with the seasons, with the smells, with the unseen things that crept beneath your clothes. Itching was constant, not the occasional scratch of discomfort, but a persistent reminder that something, many things, were always living just beneath the surface. Lice weren't pests. They were companions. You didn't catch lice. You kept them. They stayed through winter, nested in seams and scalps, appearing in beds, cloaks, and even prayers for relief. Everyone had them, lords and laborers alike. A noblewoman with embroidered sleeves and a hairnet of silver might still have spent her morning bent over a comb, scraping away the eggs of creatures who cared nothing for status. Children slept beside animals, curled on straw-filled sacks that rustled with fleas. Bedding was seldom cleaned, and when it was, the goal wasn't perfection, it was pest control. Methods varied, but the results were the same: temporary peace. Some boiled their garments, hoping the heat would do what their fingers could not. Others placed clothes beside open fires, close enough to scorch the lice but not the wool. It was a delicate balance. One wrong move, and your only tunic became both clean and ash. Illustrations from the period show figures holding shirts outstretched toward flames. It wasn't laundry day, it was execution, and if you could bear it, there was the razor. Monks led the way, not always out of piety, but practicality. A shaved scalp was the surest path to fewer itches. For some, it became a style. For others, a sacrifice. In colder climates, baldness meant vulnerability to wind and chill, but also freedom from constant crawling. Wigs, when worn, became new battlegrounds, soft, warm, and terrifyingly inviting to vermin. Beyond lice, there were fleas. They lurked in straw, in cloaks, in the very walls. People slept with animals for warmth, and animals returned the favor with bugs. Herbal sachets were tossed between blankets. Lavender, mint, thyme. Anything believed to repel pests. Smoke was used too, thick and choking. Homes were filled with it, doors shut tight, the air made thick enough to kill what bit. It worked sometimes, but mostly it annoyed the pests into brief retreats. But if the scratching was part of daily life, so was the smell. It didn't linger, it lived. Medieval cities stank with a kind of permanence that no amount of rose water could mask. Open sewers ran between homes. Gutters overflowed. Livestock added their contributions freely, and yet life continued. People walked those streets with baskets, babies, and bad shoes. They didn't flinch because there was nothing to compare it to. To fight the stink, people improvised. Pomanders, tiny containers filled with spices or resin, were worn like amulets. You could hold them to your nose in moments of particularly foul air, which was often. Wealthy ladies braided herbs into their hair or tucked scented bundles into their bodices. Men might carry perfumed cloths in their sleeves, bringing them to their faces with studied indifference. It wasn't about changing the world's scent. It was about surviving it. And when things got unbearable, there was always linen, the unsung savior, the soft armor between body and outerwear. Linen absorbed the worst of it, the sweat, the oils, the dust of unwashed skin. If it could be washed, the person wearing it didn't have to be, and so linen shirts were scrubbed, beaten on stones, boiled in lye. They were bleached by sun and scoured by river water, cleaned more frequently than the people inside them. Changing your shirt was, in many cases, the medieval equivalent of taking a shower. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough. A clean shirt beneath a dirty tunic sent a message. I try. I care. I'm doing what I can. Cleanliness was performative, like much of medieval life. You showed it in your sleeves, in the color of your underclothes, in how often you scratched. If you could keep the lice away from your neckline, if your linen was pale and fresh-smelling, relatively speaking, you were ahead of the curve. Hygiene wasn't a science. It was an act of resilience, a form of hope wrapped in boiling cloth and dandelion tea. And while it didn't meet our modern standards, it was a kind of cleanliness. Not perfect, not consistent, but born from the same human desire we still hold today, to feel whole, to feel presentable, to feel, in whatever way possible, clean. In the great and unsanitary theater of medieval life, nothing embodied the tension between survival and sensibility quite like the matter of waste. Human waste, to be specific. The question of where to relieve oneself and what to do with the result was not so much a private affair as it was a public negotiation. For the privileged few perched in castles and manors, the solution came in stone. The garderobe, a drafty vertical shaft with a seat built into the wall, positioned conveniently over a pit, a ditch, or in some unfortunate designs, a moat Gravity did the rest. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. Until you were the servant cleaning it. In smaller homes, there was no such luxury. Chamber pots were the standard, ceramic or wooden bowls tucked under beds or in corners, ready to receive nightly offerings. In the morning, the contents were disposed of with a swift arm and, ideally, a loud warning. Garde à l'eau. Look out for the water became not just a courtesy but a survival instinct. Streets turned into a mosaic of puddles, refuse, and betrayal. Accuracy was not guaranteed. Down below, pigs rooted through the muck, serving as a kind of biological cleanup crew, though their appetites did more to rearrange the waste than remove it. Larger towns had rudimentary systems, central ditches, open sewers, gutters meant to carry off liquid waste. But these clogged easily and were seldom maintained. When it rained, the slurry flowed. When it didn't, it baked. The air thickened with a kind of civic aroma, one that clung to walls and woven cloaks alike. People didn't complain because there was no alternative. This was simply how the world worked. Toilet paper, as a concept, did not yet exist. In its place, moss, straw, leaves or scraps of linen if you were fortunate. The truly desperate used their hands, followed by a rinse if water allowed. In cold climates, snow served multiple purposes, cleansing, numbing, and punishing all at once. Some medieval texts suggest that wealthy households might reserve pieces of wool or other soft cloth for this task, reused and washed with quiet determination. It's easy to imagine the medieval world as a vast pit of filth, but the truth is more nuanced. People adapted to their surroundings. They managed. They developed habits that made sense for their environment. The priority was practicality over comfort and survival over sterility. Bathhouses, once again, played a curious role here. In their heyday, they weren't just for bathing. Some offered food, drink, massages, and questionable companionship. They were steamy, bustling places where hygiene and hedonism danced in circles. You could go for a scrub and leave with a full stomach, a rheuma, and possibly a new skin ailment. The best bathhouses offered warm tubs, herbal steams, even music. Families attended together. Travelers mingled with townsfolk. Monks sometimes bathed in pairs, quietly ignoring the church's warnings. It wasn't always scandalous, at least not on the surface. But temptations simmered in the corners. Shared nudity, warm water, soft voices. The church warned that bathhouses were gateways to sin, and often they were. When the plagues came, first as whispers, then as screams, these communal spaces became suspect. Doctors, operating under a very flawed understanding of disease, declared that warm water opened the body's defenses, that pores, once loosened, invited death. So, bathhouses closed, or burned, or were abandoned to rot in rats. Some southern cities held on longer. In places like southern France, parts of Italy, or the Iberian Peninsula, Roman plumbing and cultural memory kept the tradition alive a bit longer. But even there, suspicion crept in. Eventually, bathing in public became a thing of the past. What remained was the memory: tiled floors, scented steam, laughter, and regret. By the 1500s, the average person was no longer soaking in shared tubs. Instead, they were dabbing their armpits with vinegar, scrubbing their shirts in boiling urine, and hoping no one noticed the lice. The bathhouse faded from view, remembered not for its warmth, but for its fall from grace. And yet, despite everything, the desire for cleanliness persisted, not always realized, but never extinguished. People still found ways to feel fresh, to comb, to launder, to scrape and scent and survive. In a world where filth loomed large, that effort was everything. Soap in the Middle Ages was less a luxurious comfort and more a grim necessity, when it was used at all. Forget lathery clouds and floral scents. The average bar of soap in medieval Europe was more akin to a hardened lump of punishment. It was coarse, it was rough, and it did its job with all the subtlety of a sandblaster. The standard recipe was brutally simple: animal fat rendered down from sheep or pigs, mixed with lye made from wood ash. When heated and stirred for long enough, it congealed into something that could technically remove dirt, but also a fair bit of skin if you weren't careful. It scraped and scoured. If your hands were greasy, it stripped them clean. If your skin was sensitive, it reminded you who was boss. This soap wasn't made in factories but in backyards and kitchens, often by women who passed down their recipes like grim family heirlooms. The smell was harsh, earthy, smoky, and vaguely reminiscent of disappointment. Sometimes herbs were added, lavender or mint, to make it more tolerable. But more often, it was left plain and functional. Soap was primarily for laundry and heavy-duty cleaning. Washing clothes, scrubbing floors, cleaning tools. Using it on the body was an occasional act, not a regular ritual. It was simply too strong, too precious. In many households, it was locked away or rationed. If your hands were particularly filthy, after working in a field, a forge, or a tannery, you might reach for the soap. But for daily use, a cloth, warm water, and hope were more common. There were, however, alternatives. In the Islamic world and southern Europe, more refined soaps were produced. The famous Castile soap from Spain, made from olive oil, was gentler, smoother, and actually pleasant to use. These soaps, often scented and beautifully molded, were luxury goods traded across the Mediterranean. To own one was to broadcast refinement. To use one regularly was a declaration of wealth. In most of Europe, though, soap remained a utilitarian object. You might use it before a wedding, before seeing a lord, before trying to impress a potential spouse, but even then it was used sparingly. A little went a long way, and most people had more pressing things to worry about than squeaky clean elbows. For the vast majority, soap was a thing to own, not to indulge in. Something you kept in a cupboard. Something you brought out when absolutely necessary. And if you ran out, you made do. Water, cloth, vinegar, ash mixed with oil, even sand in some parts for scrubbing calloused hands.
This wasn't a world obsessed with daily cleansing. It was a world shaped by necessity. A world where soap was survival, not self-care. It was rough, it was basic, and it worked. Sometimes too well. But even with limited soap, laundry was still a ritual, grueling, communal, and absolutely necessary. Clothes mattered. A clean tunic, a fresh linen shift, a spotless veil, these were social signals. You might not bathe your body, but if your clothes were clean, people noticed. It meant you cared. It meant you tried. Doing the laundry was a full-body experience. Forget washboards and washers. Rivers were the stage. Urine, yes, real human urine, was the secret ingredient. Stored and aged into a potent liquid called chamber lye, it was valued for its ammonia content. Soiled clothes were soaked in it, then scrubbed, beaten, and rinsed in the nearest stream. The smell was awful, but the results spoke for themselves. Washerwomen were a special breed, tough, loud, relentless. Their arms were strong, their tempers short, and their knowledge of fabric deep. They knew which stains would yield and which wouldn't. They knew how long to boil wool before it shrank. They were equal parts chemist and executioner. And they took pride in their craft. After the scrubbing came the drying. Clothes were hung on bushes, laid across hedges, or stretched over ropes between trees. Medieval towns on wash day resembled chaotic gardens of swinging sleeves and flapping hems. And despite all this effort, the result wasn't always perfect. Whites yellowed, fabrics frayed, but they were clean or clean enough. And that was what mattered. The body might be overlooked, but the clothes couldn't be. Clean linen was a kind of armor against suspicion. It meant you were respectable, presentable, human. After centuries of scratching, boiling, rinsing, and rubbing, one might wonder, did any of it actually work? Did medieval hygiene, with all its strange tools and even stranger fears, keep people healthy? Or was it all just ritual and desperation wrapped in rose water and linen? The answer, like most things from the past, is more complicated than it seems. By modern standards, no, medieval hygiene wouldn't win any awards. Germ theory was centuries away. Sterilization was unheard of. The idea that invisible creatures caused illness was as foreign as space travel. And yet, within their own understanding, people weren't neglecting cleanliness. They were just working with a completely different playbook. They had systems, they had habits, they even had tools: linen, vinegar, herbs, soap, combs, and boiling water. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate efforts to manage the body and its many unpleasant realities. No one was living in a vacuum of knowledge. They were paying attention. They were watching. They were learning what worked, sort of, and what didn't. They just didn't always know why. Take vinegar, for example. Used in rinses, dabs, and even foot soaks. We now know it has mild antibacterial properties. Or consider the humble linen shirt, worn under heavier clothes to catch sweat and dirt. In the absence of showers, this strategy made sense. Change the layer, not the person. And changing it weekly, or even twice a week, was enough to keep you from becoming entirely offensive. Or take the practice of drying laundry in sunlight. They didn't know about ultraviolet sterilization, but they knew sun-dried linen smelled better. They knew that water alone wasn't enough. That soap helped. That boiling clothes drove out bugs. Even the timing of partial washes, like wiping your hands, face, or armpits, was driven by reason. These were the body's busiest zones. They needed the most attention. Was it perfect? No. Did it prevent disease? Sometimes. But not reliably. In many ways, medieval people did the best they could under the heavy hand of doctrine and fear. They lived in a world where the body was both sacred and suspicious. Too much washing, vanity; too little, sloth. Warm water, dangerous; cold water, brutal. The balance was delicate and constantly shifting. And then there was the church. Spiritual cleanliness often trumped physical health. Bathing might be viewed as indulgent, or worse, as tempting fate. The body wasn't meant to be flaunted or fussed over. It was meant to be endured, cared for, yes, but modestly, quietly, without scandal. Even so, people found moments of relief: a soak before a feast, a perfumed cloth on a hot day, a new shirt, white and crisp from the river rocks. These weren't just acts of hygiene. They were affirmations, proof that someone was still trying, still human. And while their understanding of disease was flawed, some of their instincts aged remarkably well. Avoiding filth, using herbs, cleaning high-contact areas. They lacked the framework to explain microbes or immunity, but they noticed patterns. They saw what happened when bathhouses got too crowded, or when certain smells preceded illness. They responded in their own way. So yes, medieval hygiene worked, barely and inconsistently. But it worked, enough to get people through a winter, enough to survive childbirth, enough to keep lice from turning every night into a horror show. And maybe most importantly, it kept hope alive. Because even in a world without running water, electric lights, or deodorant, people still looked in the mirror, or into a piece of polished metal, and tried to make themselves just a little more presentable. They bathed with caution. They scraped with determination. They laundered their souls as best they could. To step into the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro was to enter a world that defied the grime-soaked expectations of early urban life. No open sewage, no chaotic alleyways, no mystery mounds of waste tossed behind huts. Instead, there were grids, order, drains. The Indus Valley civilization, thriving over 4,000 years ago, had managed something many medieval and even 19th century cities failed to achieve: a functional, thoughtful urban design built around hygiene. The city's layout wasn't random. Streets ran north to south, east to west, intersecting at clean right angles like a modern blueprint. But the real marvel was beneath the feet of its ancient citizens. Hidden under brick-lined roads ran a vast drainage system. Covered, maintained, and thoughtfully connected to every home. This system carried wastewater away from living spaces. Not in ditches, not left to fester, but through enclosed passages. Houses, even modest ones, had access to water and bathrooms. Sloped floors in bathing areas guided used water toward street drains. Wells stood within courtyards, not just for drinking but for washing and cleaning. In some areas, brick platforms held vessels for pouring water over the body, primitive showers in a sense. There were no golden faucets or tiled pools, but there was intention, consistency, a belief that water could and should be managed wisely. This wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a philosophy, a civic promise that even the humblest person deserved dignity and cleanliness. And yet, unlike Babylon or Rome, Mohenjo-daro left behind no grand statues of kings, no triumphant inscriptions boasting of conquests, no military walls screaming power, just bricks, uniform in size, precise in placement, repeated across cities hundreds of miles apart. The message wasn't shouted, it was built, one bath platform at a time. Good living requires good planning. Farther west, in the Mesopotamian world, Babylon rose with a different kind of confidence. Where Mohenjo-daro whispered order, Babylon boomed spectacle. Towering ziggurats, ornate gates, and wide ceremonial roads gave the city its theatrical flair. But behind the grandeur there was structure. The city was divided with purpose. Residential quarters, markets, palaces, and sacred zones all had their place. The Ishtar Gate, with its gleaming blue tiles and proud lions, wasn't just decoration. It marked the processional route, the sacred spine of the city along which gods were paraded and power was affirmed. Roads curled with the land, but drainage channels still carried waste away. Wealthier homes had bathrooms with clay pipes. Water moved. Waste was redirected. Civilization meant more than just conquest. It meant coordination. In Teotihuacan, across the ocean in ancient Mesoamerica, the same truth unfolded under a different sun. At its peak, the city held over 100,000 people, and it was no haphazard sprawl. Streets aligned with the stars. Temples towered over precisely measured plazas. Drainage canals wove beneath the surface. Houses, often shared by extended families, were built around courtyards with designated washing areas. Water here, too, was not an afterthought. Canals prevented floods. Slopes guided rain. Ritual purity blended with real-life necessity. To clean the body was not just to feel human, it was to align with the cosmos. These cities, separated by oceans and centuries, shared something profound. Not technology, not language, but a conviction that cleanliness, structure, and public hygiene were not luxuries. They were essential, and all of this long before the flush toilet. If the cities of the ancient world shared a heartbeat, it pulsed in their planning, not just in monuments or markets, but in how they handled the invisible parts of life. Waste, water, movement, silence. Zoning, in its earliest form, wasn't a bureaucratic debate about whether someone could build a bakery next to a blacksmith. It was a sacred geometry of human function. Where people slept, where they worshipped, where they washed, it was all mapped with care. In Mohenjo-daro, zoning wasn't enforced by decree but by culture. The elevated citadel at the city's core likely served as an administrative and ritual hub. Below it, laid out with surgical neatness, the residential blocks unfurled. Granaries, workshops, and kilns sat on the edges, kept away from homes not out of snobbery but out of wisdom. Smoke, noise, and hazards had their place. So did peace and privacy. The brilliance of this system wasn't in its innovation, it was in its consistency. Other Indus cities followed the same template. Harappa, Lothal, Kalibangan, all shared a similar logic. This wasn't the whim of a single visionary. It was a shared belief. That order brought health, and health was the foundation of community. In Babylon, zoning wore its ceremonial robes proudly. At the center, temples and palaces soared, casting their shadows over processional roads and elite homes. The further one walked from the sacred heart, The more ordinary life appeared: markets, workers' quarters, gardens. But everything still had its place. The Euphrates bisected the city, not chaotically, but like a measured stroke, bringing life and trade while respecting the city's spine. Even canals had ritual significance, doubling as both practical and spiritual arteries. Teotihuacan took zoning to another level, almost as if the city had been drafted with a compass and a cosmological chart. The Avenue of the Dead, stretching 2 miles, wasn't merely a road. It was a spine around which temples, homes, and markets aligned with the stars. Sectors of the city were carved out for artisans, traders, nobility, and immigrants. Some neighborhoods housed people from distant lands, each allowed to build in their native style. It was zoning with a cultural conscience. The effect was harmony, not the absence of noise, but the absence of chaos. You knew where things belonged, where people could gather, where rituals took place, where food was traded, where silence was sacred. Even sanitation followed zoning rules. Baths, drains, latrines, they were placed deliberately. Near courtyards, away from kitchens, in corners that caught the morning sun or stayed dry in monsoon seasons. Streets sloped not by accident, but by design. Covered drains ran where feet wouldn't stumble. Wells sat close to homes but far from waste. These weren't perfect systems. They failed, clogged, crumbled, but they were there. Someone had thought it through. And perhaps most remarkably, none of these cities needed centralized empires to make it happen. The Indus Valley left behind no record of kings, no evidence of military dominance. Yet the cities operated like well-tuned machines. Their planning was silent but deeply disciplined. What does this tell us? That ancient people, separated by continents, converged on the same idea, that human life thrived best when space was respected, that zoning wasn't just civic, it was spiritual. The sacred sat above, the noisy to the edges. The daily, the dirty, the divine, each had its domain. We tend to picture the past as chaotic, markets jammed between homes, temples rising wherever ambition allowed, waste tossed wherever it could land. But again and again, ancient cities prove otherwise. They weren't just places to live. They were systems of belief encoded in stone, brick, and mud. And nowhere was this more visible than in how they placed their sacred spaces. In every great ancient city, the temple wasn't hidden. It didn't crouch behind houses or whisper its presence from a side street. It loomed. It led. It anchored. If the marketplace was the body of a city, the temple was its soul, visible from everywhere, impossible to ignore. Babylon's skyline was punctuated by the great ziggurat, Etemenenki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Its layered terraces of baked brick climbed nearly 100 meters into the air, declaring spiritual authority with every step. This wasn't just a temple, it was a cosmic axis connecting mortals to the divine. Roads radiated from it. Festivals culminated there. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was the city's spine. Teotihuacan's spiritual centers were even more intertwined with geography and astronomy. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent were laid out with deliberate precision. They aligned not with arbitrary borders but with the movements of stars and the rhythm of the solstices. The entire city was a map of the heavens, sculpted in stone. Every street walked toward the divine. In Mohenjo-daro, there were no towering temples or giant idols. But the Great Bath, carefully constructed, waterproofed with bitumen and surrounded by private rooms, spoke its own language of ritual. It may have served for ceremonial cleansing, a kind of physical and spiritual preparation. Its very presence at the city's heart suggested a belief that water was sacred, that purity was more than skin deep. Even in the absence of gods, there was reverence. What's remarkable is not just where these temples were placed, but how they were connected. They weren't walled off from the rest of the city. They were integrated. The processional roads of Babylon, the ceremonial avenues of Teotihuacan, the structured neighborhoods of Indus cities, all wove daily life and divine presence into the same fabric. You didn't need to climb a mountain to find the sacred. It was stitched into the city's veins. That unity of space and spirit shaped behavior. It guided movement. It influenced where people gathered, how they prayed, how they celebrated. A temple wasn't just for the gods, it was a compass for the community. The city itself became a living offering, its geometry a kind of worship. This design principle survived. Even today, we inherit it without realizing. Our public squares, our grand cathedrals, our mosques, our government buildings with their high domes and measured steps, they descend from this lineage. Sacredness elevated, authority made visible, belief made spatial. Ancient urban planners didn't have computer models or zoning boards, but they had something else, a deep understanding of how space shapes thought. They knew that where you place the sacred changes how people walk, where they gather, and what they feel. They knew that a city isn't just built with tools. It's built with intention. We often flatter ourselves by believing that modern cities are the first true expressions of organization, efficiency, and civilized living. But if you dig literally and metaphorically, beneath the asphalt and concrete, you find something older, deeper, that the bones of our cities are borrowed. The ideas we carry forward today, grids, sewers, civic centers, even public hygiene, were born in mud brick and carried on the backs of copper tools. Consider Mohenjo-Daro once more, a city from 2500 BCE that laid its streets in perfect right angles, that buried drains beneath walkways, that gave private bathing areas to average homes. Their belief wasn't just in gods or prosperity, it was in structure. And that structure didn't come from conquest or fear, it came from consensus. From a quiet agreement that cleanliness, order, and dignity were communal values. Babylon, so different in style, followed the same pulse. Its grandeur was louder, yes, its inscriptions carved into brick, its gates enormous and ceremonial, but beneath the pomp was purpose. The streets curved with reason. The sacred walked hand in hand with trade. Clay pipes channeled water and waste, and even the sewers bore the king's name because civic pride extended downward. And Teotihuacan, city of gods and geometry, streets aligned with stars, neighborhoods designed for immigrants, artisans, nobles, and the poor. This wasn't urban chaos. This was ritualized space, a civilization that saw no contradiction in making city planning a spiritual act. Even their drainage canals moved with cosmic logic. These weren't isolated cases. Across cultures, across millennia, people returned to the same truths. That water is life, but only if managed. That public health isn't a luxury, it's a foundation. That a clean city is a kind one. That planning is not just technical, it's philosophical. Ancient engineers didn't separate infrastructure from morality. They believed a good city should serve the body, the mind, and the soul. That belief echoes still. When we build cities today, we inherit their fingerprints. Our plumbing traces their lines. Our zoning debates mimic their decisions. Even our longing for quiet corners, shaded courtyards, and clean public spaces, those are ancient desires. We are not so modern as we think. And maybe that's the final truth medieval and ancient hygiene reveal. Not just about cleanliness, but about continuity. The people who came before us scratched their skin raw, boiled their linens, scraped their teeth with twigs, and channeled their waste into makeshift canals not because they were primitive, but because they were trying. Desperately. Inventively. Often brilliantly. They knew what we know, that cleanliness is not just comfort, it is dignity, it is civilization. And though their baths have crumbled, their drains clogged with the silt of centuries, the idea remains. Under every city street, in every public restroom, in every sewer map and zoning law and humble bar of soap, their legacy endures. We walk where they once washed. We flush what they once feared. And in doing so, we carry forward not just their mistakes, but their effort. Their cities still whisper beneath our feet. All we have to do is listen.